Alright, good day folks. Indiana Joe back here again, and we're live this time back in Paphos, in one of the cities which was certainly around at the time of Paul. Some of it is a little bit newer, so from sort of the 2nd century, but the city was certainly in existence at the time that Paul visited here. And there's lots and lots of stories, and not quite myths, but sort of accounts, historical accounts of what happened when Paul came here. In particular, one of the interesting, I suppose, things that happened was he was taken into the centre of Paphos, where a church currently is, an Orthodox church, was tied to a column and was beaten. And of course we know what eventually happened, whether or not that was true. We know what happened ultimately because it's recorded in Acts chapter 13, and if you've seen our little Cyprus video which went up yesterday, you'll know that as well. And so Paul was eventually made his way from Salamis, over on the east side of the island, to Paphos, which was the capital at the time, and we are currently in the middle of that capital part. So we've got the pre-consul's house, which is just over there. We've got an enormous house which is absolutely covered in mosaic depicting Greek myths and legends. And then just behind me here, let me see if I can turn the camera around for you, we have this rather fabulous Odeon. Now, it's sort of a bit amphitheatre-like, but technically it's an Odeon. It wasn't used especially for entertainment, but one thing that it was certainly used for was for political discussions and debates and stuff like that. And so this is the kind of thing, this structure behind me, that Paul would have been brought to in front of the pre-consul and probably most of the government in the area, and gave the gospel to them. That's where he had his run-in with Bar Yeshua, or Bar Jesus, the Jew who was really a Satan worshipper, and tried to stop the pre-consul from seeing Paul and Barnabas and Mark. And of course, as we mentioned yesterday, Paul called him out for his deceit and his lies and his worship of the devil, ended up turning him blind, and upon seeing the evidence of the truth, if you like, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the pre-consul believed. And it would have been in this kind of a situation that Paul would have stood up in front of the pre-consul and probably the rest of his government, and ended up having these discussions and giving the gospel and performing these miracles. Now, a few things I just wanted to quickly mention. We weren't allowed to film inside the big house. It was actually under a structure, and you could walk around inside and see all of the mosaics. Now, the mosaics all depicted Greek myths and legends, and I hadn't dug into my Greek myths and legends for a while, and I realised, looking around and seeing the depictions of these, I'm not missing much. It was a pretty ghastly place when it came to the myths and the legends. Some of the stuff that goes on in there in the myths and legends is quite revolting. I remember one particular scene that was depicted in the mosaics just over the hill there, which had one young man looking very embarrassed while reading a letter, and it turned out that the letter he was reading was a love letter, and it had been given to him by his stepmother, who was sat naked next to him, waiting to see his reaction. So it's not what you would call the most godly of cultures, shall we say. But then you shouldn't really be surprised. The Greeks took a lot of their influence from the ancient Babylonians. And if you know anything about the ancient Babylonians, you'll know that they also were not the most godly of people. And the ancient Babylonians took their inspiration from the Sumerians, and the Sumerians were one of the cultures that first grew up out of the Tower of Babel. In other words, you can see an epicenter of paganism, which started at the Tower of Babel upon man's rejection of God. And you'll notice there's a very interesting little phrase that God says. He says, look at the man, they're all together. Now nothing that they want to do shall be held from them. You see, people can be very powerful when we come together. We're made in the image of God. And as a result, we're very creative. We have power. Not as much power as God does, because we're only an image, but it's interesting that God had to limit our ability by confusing our languages and scattering us across all the face of the earth. And you can see this sort of epicenter of paganism almost, which came out of this Middle Eastern area and spread. And you can really see the result of that here in Cyprus through Aphrodite, who is really the Greek version of Ishtar, the goddess of fertility and basically sexual immorality, which was the Babylonian goddess, which came from the old Sumerian goddess, and of course we know her in the Roman culture as Venus. Same goddess, same spirit, same demonic being behind it. And so you can see this epicenter of paganism spread out, and you can see this influence throughout all of the Western world. So it's interesting to see the kind of culture that Paul was really approaching, what he was coming up against. And as we wander around, I mean, absolutely everywhere you look, there's ruins, and let's turn the camera around here again. There we go, huge great big marble column there. We're in the middle of basically the equivalent of the park. There's the Odeon over there. You can see the modern day lighthouse. And this is the kind of thing that Paul would have had to walk up and see. This is the kind of thing which he'd have had to engage with. When he'd finished with the local synagogues, he went and engaged with the local people and gave them the gospel, gave them the truth. And as we saw the other day, we saw that some people believed, some people mocked, some people said, we'll hear you again on this matter. So it's great to get out here, and as you can see, the sun is glorious. It really is an archaeologist or somebody who's interested in history, really is their sort of, paradise. I just want to show you, let's get out of the sun here, down on the ground, right? We're just walking along, right? Look at all the rubble. Can you see all the pottery? I mean, literally everywhere that you look, there's bits of 2,000 to 3,000 year old Roman pottery just lying around lying around on the ground, used as rubble to sort of protect the road. And everywhere you look, there's this reminder of history. There's this reminder of what it was like back in its heyday. But one final thought to leave you with before we sign out. This culture is no more. And something that you can see, a pattern that you can see spring up around the world, is you have a culture, you have a group of people, a civilization, which rises up through the ranks, becomes perhaps the most powerful culture on earth. And they always seem to fall to the same mixture of sins. Sexual immorality and the worship and glorification of sexual immorality. You see, Aphrodite was viewed as sort of a bisexual figure. There were no morals, there were no limits to what you could do in this area with sexuality. Child murder or child sacrifice is another thing that crops up often in these civilizations. Think the Mayans, think of the end of the Roman civilization. And you'll find that these civilizations, which are huge and the most powerful things on earth, just suddenly collapse, almost overnight. It's almost as if God just says, that's enough. You've gone too far. You've gone far enough. I'm finishing it now. You see, I do believe, and I know that John does, and I know that most of us here at Creation Research do, believe in a sovereign God. A God who is the same yesterday, today and forever, and a God who is in control of the nations. In fact, he even says many times in scriptures that it's God who appoints those in charge. He put King Nebuchadnezzar in charge to judge the people of Israel. So it's interesting seeing this pattern where you have a civilization that rises up at the minute they fall to idolatry, the worship and severe practice of sexual immorality, and child sacrifice, the civilization collapses. Now, I'm not going to go any further than that, other than to just ask you to think about the way that the world is going today. Where are we with those three things? With idolatry, with sexual immorality, and with child sacrifice, the murdering of babies. It's interesting to think about, and it should be a sobering reminder that the Lord's Day is coming. We don't know when, but we know it's coming. And that's something that we should not only be sobered by, but as Christians we should rejoice in. But it should push us to spread the gospel, no matter where we go. Just like Paul did when he visited this very place 2,000 years ago. Indiana Joe out.